Are you completing your 601 or 601A extreme hardship waiver packet and you are not sure if you have included everything? Well, in this video, I am going to talk about 3 pieces of evidence that I like to include because they make a significant impact. So we're going to talk about those things and make sure that you understand why each of those things matter so that you can decide whether you should include it in your packet. I am U.S. immigration attorney Lilian Chukwurah, and I help my clients get green cards and citizenships for themselves and their families using the U.S. immigration law system. The first piece of evidence that I like to include is a psychological evaluation. This is from a mental health professional that is licensed, where they meet with the client and they talk to you about your situation, your life, and while talking to you, they can do evaluations based on different scales. For example, they could do a test to see if you meet the requirements or have the symptoms for different mental health issues. For example, they can do a test to see if you meet the requirements to be diagnosed or potentially diagnosed as having anxiety. And then if you do have anxiety or you meet those requirements based on the scale, they can tell you, well, we believe that you do meet the requirements for anxiety, but it may be a mild or severe or whatever the scale is. They may also be able to, from the scales and the questions they are going to ask you, determine if you have PTSD, how severe your PTSD is, and what are the symptoms of that PTSD that show up in your day-to-day life. And most importantly, so not only does this medical professional determine if you do have these mental health issues and diagnosis, they can then from there make a statement about what would happen to your diagnosis, what will happen to your PTSD, what will happen to your anxiety, your depression, whatever it is, what would happen if you were separated from your spouse, if you had to leave with your spouse, what would happen in your life. So that is why a psychological evaluation is so useful and so important, because it goes beyond just saying, I spoke to this person and I think they may be able to be diagnosed with this, but it goes beyond that. It goes to, this is what they currently have. If they continue the way they are, or if something gets worse, this is the worst case scenario of what's going to happen to them. This is realistically what will happen if the separation happens, if they're not allowed to live in the same country. These are things that a psychological evaluation can do that you would not be able to do in your affidavit, because your affidavit is about your perspective on whether you can talk about the symptoms, but you can't really diagnose yourself. A mental health professional can diagnose you. There are psychologists that do immigration psychological evaluations, and you want to meet with one of those. These are not your regular therapist. If you do have a regular therapist that has been working with you and understands the situation, your therapist can write an evaluation. But if you are not regularly meeting with a therapist that has the insights to write this report, then you should be meeting with a professional that does write these reports and understands what questions to ask and knows that the purpose of this evaluation is to get an understanding of you, of any medical issues that you may have, and to potentially have a diagnosis for you if there is one. I will tell you, most people look at psychological evaluations and think, oh, I can just go and say whatever and the therapist would just write a report. That is not how ethical psychologists work. Okay, so in the past, I use a psychological evaluation, not just for waiver cases, but for VAWA cases as well. And I have had a psychologist under a VAWA case tell me, like, I don't this is not adding up. Here are the things that happened at the at the evaluation. I do not think this person was actually abused. I think they're just fluffing up and beefing up their stuff based on the conversations that we have had. And again, this is a licensed medical professional that I am trusting to evaluate my client and give me a proper diagnosis if there is one to be had. So do not just, when people poo-poo psychological evaluations, I want you to understand that an ethical psychologist will not write a report that is inaccurate. They will not let you beef up your anxiety. They will ask you so many questions that if there is discrepancies, if there are inconsistencies, and they cannot explain those inconsistencies based on a diagnosis, it's going to raise red flags for them. So psychological evaluations are helpful, but it's only helpful if you actually do have a psychological issue that they can diagnose. And just because you do a psychological evaluation does not mean you need to include it in your packet. It's just good to have if you do have a diagnosis, and the psychological evaluation would be helpful. The next thing is a financial chart, okay? I like including these because it just gives the officer a picture of your finances. So in your affidavit, you may talk about the financial considerations of, the finances as far as rent, utilities, income, all those things. But sometimes the officer can't see the picture, and the financial chart gives the picture. And I love the financial chart. So this is how I typically do it. We have our clients list all their expenses, their monthly expenses, how much they pay a month for those expenses, and then we have them list out their income on a monthly basis and how much the spouse brings in, how much the petitioner or the applicant brings in, and then subtract that and see, okay, do they have money left over each month, or are they in a red, right? So if both of them are in the US, are working, what is the final tally of their monthly expenses versus their monthly income? And then we have a separate column where we list out if it is just the qualifying relatives. So let's say the spouse only, and it's only their income. It's typically a negative, right? I have had cases where the applicant was the sole breadwinner. They were the only ones working. So when it comes to the spouse's income, it is zero. So all the expenses will be negative if it's only the spouse in the US, and the spouse had not worked for like 20 years since they've been married. So she would need to basically figure out how to get a job, how to do anything all over again to be able to support herself and the kids. So those are the things that really, when it comes to your packet, it's like going the extra mile of painting a picture for the officer, and a financial chart can do that for you. And it's a great way to basically have the officer be able to visualize, okay, these are their expenses. Now you still want to include evidence of those expenses and evidence of the income, okay? So just because you have the chart does not mean you get away with not including the evidence, right? The chart helps create a picture of your evidence, but you still want to back up every single expense with a document. So if you say you pay rent, you need to include your lease that shows how much your rent is. If you say you have utilities and they are $1,000 a month, you better have some form of statement or receipt that shows you're paying that $1,000 a month on your utilities. So those are the things that are very important. And then if you're saying that you have like $10,000 a month in income, you better have documentation showing that $10,000 a month in income. And then the final thing that I like to include are called country condition reports, because we want to not only talk about all the hardships, but we want to talk about the hardship in connection to the country, right? We want to show that what is the hardships that the country is facing. Why do you think that you will face these hardships in these countries? Well, because there's documentation to show it. So for example, if you are saying that it is going to cost you $2,000 a month to live in that country, to have a place to live, to basically survive in that country every single month, you need to have some form of thing to show it. And we usually use a website called Numbeo, Numbeo, and it will depend on the country, and sometimes within the country it may have different regions, and depending on where you plan to live, it will give you like a spreadsheet of this is the average cost of living in US dollars. So that way you can actually have some documentation about the country conditions, the financial conditions over there, to back up your claim that it is going to cost this much for you to live in that country for a month. So another thing we'd like to include is country conditions report, because it would typically have some information on labor laws, arrests, if there's any extrajudicial killings, anything that can affect the person. We want to basically include that in the country conditions report to be like, hey, there's a massive issue in this country on this particular issue, and the applicant and the qualifying relative fit within that issue, and this can cause a problem. So for example, if the applicant is a member of the LGBTQIA community and they're going to a country that criminalizes being a member of the LGBTQIA community, then having them move to that country is going to be an issue, and their spouse is going to have a hardship, because now they have to not only worry about the fact that their spouse is in another country and there's this separation, but they're also going to be worried about the fact that their spouse may be killed while they're in that country because of who they are. So it's using the country conditions, but tying it back to the hardship, to the qualifying relative. So that's really the key here. Another place that I'd like to use country conditions is looking at news articles, Financial Times articles, because if you're saying that it's hard to find a job in that country, they probably have a high unemployment rate, and you need to be able to show that, right? And when a country has a high unemployment rate, there's typically articles talking about it. So we typically like to search and include those. If there are, if the country has limited medical, access to medical equipment, access to medical treatment, access to mental health treatment, I like to include those articles, because again, those are things that will help back up the fact that moving to that country is not going to be helpful to the client. So yes, you can have your affidavit, yes, you can have all those things, but you still need to show that the things you're saying in your affidavit actually are the things that are happening in that country. So if you're saying in your affidavit that it's going to be hard for you to get a job in that country because of the unemployment rate, then you need to be able to show what the unemployment rate is, and that you need to show that it's really high and it's going to be very difficult for you to find a job there. So really important, country conditions, really something that is overlooked by most people applying for a 601A and the 601 waiver. So those are the 3 pieces of evidence that I like to include in almost every single waiver application that we file. The only time that I do not include a psychological evaluation is if my client already has extensive medical reports showing their medical condition, their mental health condition. In those cases, we don't need a psychological evaluation because they have been evaluated multiple times and we're able to use those reports. But outside of that, a psychological evaluation is almost always recommended. Remember, the 3 pieces of evidence is psychological evaluation, financial chart, and country condition documents and reports. if you have any questions about any of these, please feel free to put them in the comments. And if you're working on your own 601A or 601 packet and you have questions, please feel free to reach out to me and schedule a consultation, and we can talk about what options are available to you, what type of evidence you should be thinking about including. And if you're in a position where you have your packet together, but you're not really sure if you have everything in there and you would like my eyes on your packet, go ahead and schedule that consultation. We can talk about how we can work together to get you that packet audit so that I can review all your evidence, all your forms, and let you know if there's anything I believe that is missing that you should be including in your packet. And if you want help preparing your 601 or 601A packet, feel free to reach out as well. We are offering a packet preparation service and a packet audit service for the 601 and 601A waivers. If you would like to take advantage of either of this, please go to my website, lilylegal.com, click on contact us, and schedule a date and time that works best for you for us to talk about your situation.